I remember the exact second I stopped flinching at the sound of his voice. It wasn't when I found the second phone charger in his car that wasn't mine. It wasn't when he sat me down at our own kitchen table and told me, in the calm tone he used for board meetings, that he wanted a divorce. It wasn't even when my niece Camille walked into that mediation room wearing a blazer that cost more than my first car, and took the seat beside him like she belonged there. It was the moment right after when my attorney, a soft-spoken man named Walter Briggs, who I had never once heard raise his voice in 4 years, let out a laugh so sudden it cracked the air in that room like a dropped glass. I watched Camille's face, that smooth, rehearsed expression she'd worn since she walked in, sitting close enough to my husband that their shoulders touched, slipped. Just for a second. But I saw it. My name is Eleanor Vance. And this is the story of the day. Two people walked into a room, already certain they'd won, and found out the game they thought they were playing had never belonged to them at all. Let me tell you what my life looked like from the outside, because it looked like something out of a magazine. A restored Victorian in the Garden District of New Orleans, the kind with a wraparound porch and heart pine floors I'd refinished myself over 2 summers, on my hands and knees with a sander, because I needed to understand the bones of the house before I could call it mine. That's always been how I operate, from the inside out. My husband, Marcus Whitfield, came from the Whitfield family. The kind of old Louisiana money that doesn't show up loud. It shows up in the deed records of half the commercial real estate downtown. His grandfather had started Whitfield Provisions in 1958. As a single wholesale grocery distributor, working out of a warehouse near the river. By the time Marcus's father, Harold Whitfield, was done building it, Whitfield Provisions was a $400 million regional food distribution company, supplying restaurants and grocery chains across 6 states. Harold was 71 when I married Marcus. Still sharp but tired, ready to hand the reins over. And everyone, the trade publications, the Chamber of Commerce, the extended family, assumed Marcus was the natural heir. He had the title, President and CEO, his name on the letterhead, his face at the ribbon cuttings, and behind him, the way women doing the real work so often are invisible. Me. I had a background in logistics and contract law, 15 years of it before I ever met Marcus. Mostly consulting for regional distributors, who didn't know they were hemorrhaging money through bad vendor terms, until someone like me sat down and read the fine print. Nobody else had bothered to read in a decade. I was good at it. When Marcus and I married, I stepped back from outside consulting, not because he asked, but because Whitfield Provisions needed exactly the kind of eyes I had, and honestly, I loved the work. What I did over the next 6 years wasn't glamorous. It was spreadsheets after midnight at the kitchen table, while Marcus watched football in the next room. It was driving to Baton Rouge and Lafayette to meet with cold storage vendors, because Marcus hated being away from the city. It was a full renegotiation of the company's trucking contracts that saved Whitfield Provisions almost $6 million over 3 years, and a complete restructuring of their produce supplier agreements that fixed a margin leak nobody had noticed for 8 years. I never asked for my name on anything. I had Marcus. I had the work. I thought that was the whole deal. Camille came into my life when I was 22, and my younger sister, Patricia, married into a family with a daughter from a previous relationship. Camille was 12 then, all elbows and quiet watchfulness, the kind of kid who studied a room before she said a word in it. We were never close, not really, but we were family in the way you don't question, the way you assume means something. I should have questioned it. I found out on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of New Orleans afternoon, where the heat hasn't broken yet, even though the calendar says it should have. I'd come home 2 days early from a supplier trip to Memphis. The meetings had finished faster than expected, and I hadn't called ahead because I wanted to surprise Marcus, maybe pick up gumbo from the place on Magazine Street he loved. Just have a quiet evening. I'm not going to walk you through every detail of what I found when I came through my own front door. I'll just say there was no ambiguity to reach for, no innocent explanation my mind could construct, even though for a few seconds it tried very hard to. And the thing that moved through me standing in that doorway wasn't the dramatic movie kind of devastation. It was quieter, colder. Marcus looked up and saw me, and the first thing on his face, before guilt, before calculation, before anything resembling shame, was irritation. Like I'd walked into the wrong house and interrupted something that had nothing to do with me. Camille stood up slowly. She didn't rush. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Level and unbothered, almost clinical. "You always knew this was coming, Eleanor," she said. "Some people build things. Other people are just the ones who end up holding them. That's how it's always worked." I drove to my sister's house and sat in the car outside for almost an hour before I could make myself go in. The next morning, I called Walter Briggs, my personal attorney, not the family's, not the company's, mine. I'd hired him 5 years earlier on the advice of a mentor who once told me over coffee that any woman doing serious financial work inside a family business needed her own independent counsel, full stop, no exceptions. That single piece of advice turned out to be the most important thing anyone ever told me professionally. What followed was 7 weeks of very quiet, very careful work, while Marcus and Camille moved openly through the city, showing up together at a Whitfield Provisions vendor gala, being seen at restaurants, behaving like people who believed the story was already finished. Walter and I built something behind the scenes. Not out of spite. Not even out of anger by that point. Out of precision. The mediation took place in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building overlooking the Mississippi. All glass on one side, so you could watch the barges move slow and gray along the water. That morning the sky was the flat white color New Orleans gets right before a storm, and the light coming through those windows made everything look slightly too bright. Too exposed. Camille got there before I did. I heard later she'd arrived almost an hour early. She wore a cream-colored blazer, pearl earrings, dark trousers pressed sharp enough to cut paper. Her hair was different, smoother, more deliberate. She looked dressed for a press conference, not a divorce mediation. She sat down beside Marcus at the far end of the table. She had no legal standing to be there at all. She wasn't a party to the divorce. She had no attorney representing her in that room. She was there because this was a performance, and she'd dressed for the part. Marcus's attorney was a man named Philip Aldridge, a high-asset divorce specialist with a strong reputation. Retained, I'd find out later, at a rate that reflected how confident he was in the outcome. He'd reviewed what Marcus's side had disclosed about our marital estate and built a settlement offer that was technically defensible and financially thin. Clean. Fast. Built for a woman who didn't fully understand what she was owed. Walter and I sat across from them. He set a slim navy folder flat on the table in front of him and left it closed. The preliminary paperwork got passed around. Philip made his opening statement. Something about proportionate distribution. Something about acknowledging Marcus's central role in growing the company. Walter let him finish every sentence without interrupting once. Then Camille reached into her purse. I don't know what was in her head. Maybe the quiet in the room felt unfinished to her. Maybe she'd rehearsed this for weeks. Maybe she just couldn't let the moment end without putting her own stamp on it. She pulled out a single bill, crisp, fresh from the bank. She held it between 2 fingers and slid it across the table until it stopped right in front of my legal pad. Take the 100, she said, smiling. Like there was nothing warm left in her at all. Get yourself a cab home to Mom's. We're finished here. The room went completely still. Philip Aldridge actually flinched. A small, involuntary pull at the corner of his mouth he didn't quite manage to hide. Marcus's jaw tightened. Not with embarrassment, with the specific irritation of a man whose carefully planned script had just gone off the rails. And then Walter Briggs laughed. Not polite. Not a throat-clearing kind of laugh. A real one, sharp and sudden, that bounced off the glass walls and filled up that whole bright room with something nobody in it had planned for. Marcus sat up so fast his chair scraped the floor. What is so funny right now? Walter took his glasses off, cleaned them slowly with the corner of his handkerchief, put them back on. Then he picked up the navy folder, set it dead center on the table, and turned it so the embossed lettering on the cover faced Marcus's side of the room. My apologies, Walter said, his voice dropping into something quiet and very even. I wasn't expecting that particular statement to be entered into the record. It changes the posture of this conversation significantly, and entirely in my client's favor. Camille's voice went sharp. Excuse me? Walter looked at her for a long, unhurried second. I'm laughing, he said. Because you and your boyfriend appear to be operating under the sincere impression that Marcus Whitfield holds controlling authority over Whitfield Provisions. He tapped the folder once with a single finger. He doesn't. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. The earlier quiet had been pressurized, the held breath kind, everyone waiting for me to fold. This one was hollow, like a support beam had been pulled out from under one side of the room, and nobody knew yet whether the whole thing would hold. Philip Aldridge leaned forward fast. That's a significant claim. I'd want to see whatever documentation. You're holding it, Walter said. What was inside that folder was this. Harold Whitfield, Marcus's father, the man who had spent 40 years turning a single warehouse near the river into a regional distribution empire, had never legally handed over controlling authority to his son. Not in any binding sense. Marcus had the title. He had the photo at the ribbon cuttings, his name on the letterhead, his quotes in the trade magazines. What he didn't have were the votes. Almost 4 years before the divorce, Harold had quietly restructured the company's ownership into a family operating trust. That trust held 58% of all voting shares, controlling interest. Every major decision, every acquisition, every structural change above a certain dollar threshold required trustee sign-off. And the person holding full fiduciary authority over that controlling stake wasn't Marcus. It was me. Harold had made that call during the year. I'd spent rebuilding the company's entire trucking and cold storage logistics network. He'd watched me work for months without saying much about it. He'd seen how I read a contract, how I found the exact spot where a system was bleeding, how I fixed things in ways that actually held instead of just looking fixed on paper. He was a builder himself in the oldest sense of that word, and he recognized what he was looking at. Without telling Marcus, without telling another soul, he decided the person who actually understood the business deserved the legal authority to match it. Harold Whitfield executed the trust restructuring 4 years ago this past spring, Walter said, sliding pages across the table one at a time, slow and deliberate. Eleanor Vance Whitfield was named sole trustee of the Whitfield Family Operating Trust. That trust controls 58% of all voting shares. Mr. Whitfield retains his title and a minority equity position. He cannot authorize a merger, approve a sale, restructure debt, or execute any transaction above $250,000 without trustee approval. Walter paused, let it sit. Without Eleanor's approval. Philip was reading fast now, flipping through pages with the focused, slightly frantic energy of a man realizing the entire foundation of his case had just dissolved underneath him. It wasn't panic exactly. It was the controlled, professional version of panic, which is somehow worse to watch. Marcus had gone completely still. Not the restless stillness of a man waiting for his turn to speak, the rigid, breathless stillness of someone trying to rearrange everything he thought he understood about his own life. Camille looked at Marcus, then at the documents, then back at Marcus. For the first time in the 18 years I'd known her, through holidays and family dinners and everything that had brought us to that room, she had absolutely nothing to say. No comeback, no exit line, nothing. There's one more matter, Walter said. 4 years ago, before I began doing substantive work for the trust, I advised Eleanor to formalize her contributions to Whitfield Provisions through an independent consulting agreement. Not as a spouse helping out, not as family pitching in, as a contracted professional with documented scope, deliverables, and compensation terms. At the time I'd signed it almost as a formality, a piece of paper Walter said was smart to have, tucked away in a drawer and mostly forgotten. That piece of paper, and 4 years of documented work attached to it, was the second item in the folder. My client entered into a formal consulting agreement with Whitfield Provisions prior to beginning the work in question, Walter said. The scope covered logistics restructuring, vendor contract renegotiation, and supply chain strategy. Her documented contributions include a trucking and cold storage overhaul that reduced operating costs by an estimated $5.9 million over 3 years, and a produce supplier renegotiation that corrected a margin shortfall that had gone unaddressed for nearly a decade. He looked directly at Philip. Compensation owed under that agreement is separate from and independent of any marital asset calculation. It's a contractual obligation of the company itself, not of Mr. Whitfield personally, which means the settlement your client proposed doesn't come anywhere close to reflecting my client's actual financial position. Philip asked for a recess. Walter gave him 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, Camille didn't say a single word to Marcus. She sat with her hands folded on the table, staring at some fixed point past the window, out at the gray water and the barges moving slow under that flat white sky. The $100 bill was still sitting there on the table in front of my legal pad. Nobody touched it. I'm not going to walk you through the entire settlement. Some of it stays confidential by mutual agreement, and that's fine by me. What I'll tell you is what mattered. Marcus kept his title at Whitfield Provisions and his minority stake. He kept the condo he'd moved into downtown, and the boat, and the watch collection, and every visible surface marker of a life he'd built around an image of himself. What he lost was everything underneath that image. The authority he'd let everyone, including Camille, believe he actually had. The story he'd been telling about who he was. That story was over. The consulting agreement was honored in full. The trust structure was formally acknowledged as part of the settlement record. I walked out with a financial outcome that actually reflected 6 years of real, documented, consequential work, not the outcome of a woman dismissed with $100 and a cab fare. Camille left the building before the final signatures were even exchanged. I didn't watch her go. I just heard the door. I heard much later, through a cousin we both still talked to, that she and Marcus didn't make it past the following spring. No announcement, no public falling out, it just stopped. The way things built on a false foundation eventually do. Quietly. Without ceremony. Harold called me 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized. He didn't say much. Asked how I was holding up. Said he was glad Walter had been thorough. There was a long pause on the line, and then he said, in that unhurried way he had, "You always saw this business clearer than anyone in my family ever did, Eleanor. I just made sure the paperwork finally agreed with you." I stayed on as trustee for another 16 months. Harold and I worked well together, we always had. When it felt like a natural place to step back, I did, by choice. I left the trust in clean, well-documented order, and walked out of Whitfield Provisions for the last time, on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, when the azaleas along St. Charles were just starting to open up. I live uptown now, a smaller house, a kitchen I actually enjoy cooking in, a desk by a window where the light lands right in the late morning. I consult independently these days, mostly for regional distributors, who need someone who can read between the lines of a balance sheet, find the assumptions nobody's questioned in years, see what's actually happening underneath the story a company tells about itself. I'm good at it. I've always been good at seeing what's actually there. Here's what I want to leave you with. Camille slid that $100 bill across the table because she'd already decided what I was. Finished. Replaceable. A chapter closing. She'd written the ending before she ever walked into that room, and she just wanted me to confirm it for her. What she never considered, what people like her almost never consider, is everything that happens before the room. The years of quiet, documented, unglamorous work, nobody photographed or toasted to. The agreements filed away in a drawer. The restructuring that saved millions, and never had anyone's name attached to it. She saw the surface of a life and assumed she understood the whole thing underneath it. She was wrong, and the moment Walter Briggs laughed, that sharp, real, involuntary laugh that rang off the glass walls of that conference room on the 14th floor above the river, that was the exact moment the room found out. The people who underestimate you aren't always wrong about everything. Sometimes they're right that you're quiet. Right that you don't take up much space. Right that you never made a show of what you were building. They're just wrong about what any of that means. So I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. Has someone ever underestimated you so completely that when the truth finally came out, even you were surprised by what you'd quietly built? Tell me your story. I read every single one. And if this one stayed with you, you already know what to do.